Hello, rascals and resident sleepers. My name is TBSky, and recently I was looking through my YouTube statistics and discovered that one of the most common search terms that lead people to my channel is boyfriend ASMR sleep comfort. Now, this is in reference to an April Fool's video I did in 2019, where I published a video called ASMR Boyfriend Gently Comforts You to Sleep While It Rains Outside. The joke of that video, at least to me, was that it wasn't a jump scare video or a mockery of ASMR or comfort videos like it. I genuinely tried, as best I could, to actually create an ASMR comfort video. Now, to some people, it was funny. To other people, it felt kinda creepy, the way that ASMR sometimes does, but to a surprising number of people, it was apparently genuinely quite helpful and comforting. And the video has continued to slowly get views and comments from people who enjoyed it over time. My friends and community responded to this news by jokingly suggesting that, hey, why don't you do a character design video but make it ASMR? And honestly, it's 2020, it's a hell year, and why not create something calming and nice for once? Now, I don't experience the autosensory meridian response, or ASMR, so I don't rightly know how to trigger it in others, but I'll do my very best to at least create something that's calming, comforting, and affirming. If this kind of thing is not for you, trust me, I understand. Don't worry, I'm not changing the brand of my channel. This is just a bit of fun for me, and hopefully some enjoyment for those of you who like this kind of thing. Anyway, what better subject to help calm us all down than one of the most aggravating character designs in the entire game of League of Legends? Kai'Sa, the daughter of the Void. Now, if you followed me here for a while, you may know already that I have rather a low opinion of Kai'Sa's character design, but it's been a long time now since she was released, or at least it feels like it was 200,000 years ago. And the video I created at the time, outlining my problems with her character design, might not be fresh in everyone's mind, or perhaps you haven't seen it, so, well, maybe it's time for a bit of a refresher. And we'll start with a bit of history, because Kai'Sa is the daughter of Kassadin, a much older League of Legends champion. Now, Kassadin's daughter has been a part of League of Legends lore for a very long time. It's one of those famous dangling unresolved plot threads that Riot sort of teased once upon a time but never actually got around to following up on. There was some suggestion in the lore that Malzahar perhaps had abducted Kassadin's daughter, thus, spurring him on to becoming the Void Walker, traveling through the Void and its dark passages, trying to find his lost family. Some of this has been incorporated into what Kai'Sa eventually became. In the lore that she eventually got, she was a normal child born to normal parents, although Kassadin, as we know, will eventually become somewhat less than normal. And one day, when she's playing outside, well, a void rift opens up pretty much beneath her feet, which is a thing that happens in Shurima sometimes after the tragedy that happened in the doomed nation-state of Icathia, who summoned the Void in the hopes of breaking free from the Shuriman Empire. Ever since then, the Void has been eating away at Runeterra from below the sands of Shurima. This is also where Rek'Sai comes from. Anyway, in the depths of the Void Rift, Kai'Sa and a handful of other survivors try to make their way through the darkness, not having that much success surviving because the Void is hungry and it is always consuming. Kai'Sa, in possession of a knife, manages to kill a Voidling, but its unnatural other-dimensional skin begins to stick to her. It becomes a symbiote that attaches to her and grows over her skin, providing her with defenses and a means to survive, but also slowly eating away at some part of her humanity. For years, Kai'Sa survives in the darkness of the Void Caves below Shurima, sometimes finding a way out, sometimes helping people who had otherwise been trapped in those dark caverns, but her infection by the Void also leaves her apart from her people. She becomes a determined survivor and warrior, fighting as hard as she can to hold back the spread of the Void and save the people of Shurima from its endless consumption. This is not at all a bad premise for a character. The Void is a fascinating entity in League of Legends lore. It has many potential uses as part of interesting narratives about survival and the ways in which people react and respond to the cosmic nihilism that the Void on some level represents. Malzahar goes mad and becomes the Void prophet, obsessed with spreading it all across the material universe. Kai'Sa absorbs some part of its nihilistic destructive power into herself and turns it on the source from whence it came. And looking over the concept art and early explorations of the character that Riot themselves have released, the concept artists at Riot imagined Kai'Sa early on as very much a hybrid character, both human and infected with the Void. Multiple versions of her show her having glowing purple eyes or physical deformations and transformations caused by her interaction with the Void parasite. The Void suit itself was also largely conceptualized as either an exoskeleton or some kind of Iron Man-like mech battlesuit that envelops Kai'Sa like a shell of armor. Most notable to me, though, is that in pretty much all of the concept art explorations of Kai'Sa, she does not have perfectly immaculate hair. Oftentimes it is roughly braided, as you might expect a person to do if they are out for survival for a long time and not exactly in possession of combs and conditioner. And sometimes it is twisted, as you might expect, into dreadlocks that flow wildly across her hair. All of this, while certainly a bit of visual stereotyping, codes Kai'Sa as a kind of wild person, someone who is apart from civilization and unable to conform to its beauty standards, because of course that kind of thing requires a certain amount of extra time on your hands, not spent surviving against the horrors of an encroaching otherworld. And while there's a healthy debate to be had about the politics of hair, which, yes, believe me, is a much more extensive subject than you might think, it does at least demonstrate an awareness on the part of the character designers that in order for Kai'Sa's lore, her story as someone who was cast into the abyss as a child and who survived alone by absorbing some aspect of the... In order for all of that to come through, it has to be coded into her design some way, somehow. Some part of what Kai'Sa looks like needs to look, in some way or another, wild, untamed, and uncivilized. And again, civilized is a term that comes with a whole host of difficult baggage. Just look at Nidalee, for example, or even better, don't look at Nidalee, because her character design is kind of cringe-worthy in 2020, and probably also in the late 2000s when she was first released, come to think of it. There's also some interesting stuff going on with the conceptualization of her voidling suit, the parasite that's attached to her, as essentially a piece of power armor or a hard outer shell that she puts on in order to be able to withstand the ravages of the Void. Visually, it does a good job of telling the story that Kai'Sa, in order to survive the hardships that she's going through, on some level has to shroud her humanity away, her vulnerabilities, behind a shell that is functionally indistinguishable from the very thing that she's trying to destroy. People see her and fear her because they correctly identify where the power to fight the Void has originated. Kai'Sa has appropriated the Void's hatred for life and turned it against itself, but she is still covered in all the visual signs and signifiers of a Void monster. And again, in order for that part of her lore to come through in her character design, then we, as the viewer, also have to see her, and while perhaps we are not fooled, we need at least to be able to suspend our disbelief and say, oh, right, I can see why someone who lives in the League of Legends universe would fear this and take it for a monster rather than a person in a Void-themed skin suit. So, looking at the character design we actually got, how much of this successfully comes through with the character? And in case you haven't guessed it yet, my answer to that question is, well, it doesn't. Like, almost none of it comes through, in fact. Kai'Sa, as she is presented in her character design, doesn't look like a hard-bitten survivor who has spent all the years since her childhood desperately struggling against the overwhelming might of an encroaching hell dimension. She doesn't look like someone who has been forcibly bonded with something monstrous and terrible that is slowly eating away at her humanity and making her unrecognizable to her own people. She doesn't look inhuman. She doesn't even look a little bit frightening. Instead, from a visual perspective, one of the primary design goals of Kaisa, apparently, was to make her physically and sexually attractive. Now, I want to stress that there's absolutely nothing wrong with having physically and sexually attractive characters in a story. In fact, I very much enjoy seeing sexy characters in video games. They are an enjoyable thing to look at. But that sexiness should, at least in my opinion, be actually relevant to who the character is. That is to say, they should at the very least not have direct reasons in their lore not to look the way that they do. For example, with a character like Elise, who is very explicitly a seductress and also a noblewoman at the highest levels of Noxian society, yeah, sure, having her be physically attractive makes a lot of sense. Having her wear makeup and strange outfits and having her care deeply about her appearance are perfectly sensible aspects of her character design. The sexy, deadly femme fatale archetype is very old for a reason. It's an archetype that works, and in the right hands, it can even be tremendously empowering for women if you're concerned about setting a good example with your storytelling. The trouble is, in her lore, Kaisa isn't a femme fatale. In fact, Kaisa doesn't seem to have any romantic entanglements or even inclinations whatsoever. Her existence is defined by a single overriding struggle to prevent the void from consuming Shurima and all of Runeterra. Everything that she cares about is to be a warrior capable of defending her people. She's a person whose entire life has been defined by the practical concerns of survival. First, as a child, tossed into the void, forced to accept a symbiotic relationship with a voidling, the thing that she hates most of all, because that symbiotic relationship gives her the power to survive and fight back, and then later, as an adult who has come to understand the full scope of the threat of the void, she hones and practices and empowers her void suit in order to give her the ability to fight back against this overwhelming threat. So why then, when you look certainly at her splash art, is the most prominent physical feature on the character her cleavage? It is centered in the image. It is literally spotlighted by the lighting in the environment, and so is her face, upon which she seems to be wearing immaculate makeup. And while I'm not much of a makeup expert, she's certainly got plucked eyebrows, eyeliner, mascara, and perhaps fake lashes? It's a little bit hard to tell from where we're sitting, but looking at her character model, certainly those eyelashes seem a little bit too long to be occurring fully naturally. And once again, I have absolutely no judgment for that as a concept, except that it doesn't make sense on the character that it has been applied to. Now, it's been suggested to me that perhaps it would be an interesting story beat to have Kaisa deliberately put on makeup and do the more human things in order to seem less frightening to her fellow humans. And I agree with that. That would be a very interesting story beat. It would be an interesting part of her character. Except it isn't. Like, that's the kind of thing that would perhaps be interesting if it was in the story. But it's not, and I can't really evaluate a character design on all the cool, interesting things that it might be if only the designers had done something differently. I evaluate it based on what it is. And what Kaisa is tremendously physically attractive. The suit that she wears, rather than looking like a shell of hard armor over her form protecting her from the ravages of the void, is a skin-tight latex suit, a body condom, essentially, that contours itself so closely over her shapes and her surfaces that it's hard to see it as anything but a really vague excuse to have her appear practically naked without technically being naked. It is not a defensive shell or an exoskeleton or protective in any way. It's glorified body paint, which, again, is a design element that has worked really well for another champion. Evelyn, a demoness of pain and misery who uses sexual seduction as a means to increase the heights of misery and despair that her victims feel when she turns from delivering them pleasure to pain. Evelyn is covered by goopy black shadows that cling close to her form, suggesting all the sexy and alluring forms that might be underneath, acting as a kind of glorified body paint to heighten the sexual appeal of the character. For her, this makes perfect sense, but it doesn't work for Kaisa because that's not who she is. That's not her story. In-game, Kaisa has the ability to fully envelop herself in the void suit and put a helmet on that makes her look somewhat more appropriate for the environment that she exists in, and it also helps her come across as more inhuman. But that helmet is disabled by default, and it is not present in her splash art or any of the promotional artwork of the character, or even her appearance in the animated short Warriors, where she comes to the rescue of Ezreal every time Kaisa appears as a character. Unless it's a player choosing in-game to toggle her helmet, she appears with extra, unnecessary vulnerabilities, which again runs completely counter to the entirety of her character. And her hair, too, is part of this problem, because Kaisa, as she's presented in-game and in her splash art, has perfectly immaculate hair. Her hair looks really nice. It looks like she moisturizes and conditions it and washes it regularly and brushes it with a brush and generally does all of the stuff that is necessary to take care of very long, thick hair. And the question that I ask myself is, hang on, if you spend your entire life cooped up in a voidling skin suit, wouldn't one of the first things that made you uncomfortable and that you might want to get rid of be your hair? Like, wouldn't it just be a practical thing to shave it off, I guess, or at least keep it short so that it doesn't, like, chafe up against your neck when it's sealed inside of your void suit? And again, you could meaningfully argue that, hey, maybe it's because she tries to hold on to whatever aspects of her femininity remain to her when otherwise she's so transformed into a monster. And again, that would be very interesting, but it's not part of her character or her story at any point, ever, anywhere. And as I said earlier, the politics of hair on fictional characters and indeed on real-life people are much more complicated than you would think, but for me at least, it would at least make somewhat more sense that she had her hair braided. That would be a practical way to manage it and keep it long, while also, not making it a thing that would cause her trouble as she battles against the void. Or make it unruly and matted and wild all across her head, the visual indication of someone who doesn't have even the slightest bit of time to take proper care of herself, or indeed, someone who never learned how to take care of herself because she lost her parents when she was very young. Anything would be more interesting and do more storytelling for the character than the choice which they did go with, which is, much like the makeup on her face, perfect and immaculate and clearly very well taken care of by someone with time on their hands. And speaking of being immaculate, Kaisa herself is rather immaculate as well. Again, she's someone who's been struggling against overwhelming odds and extra-dimensional space monsters since she was a little girl barely able to defend herself, but looking at her character, she doesn't have any scars. She doesn't have scars, she doesn't have battle damage, she doesn't have a broken nose that never quite got set right because she doesn't have access to medical care. There's no evidence on her body that she has lived a hard and difficult life. And I've heard an argument from people that just proves how much of a badass she is, that she's managed to live for so long and never taken any real damage, which I'm not sure that's true. Like, the number one universal signifier of a badass, dangerous, strong character that you don't want to mess with is that they have battle scars, visual signifiers that they have survived a lot of damage, that they have come through hell and come out on the other side still standing. This, again, is one of the very basic aspects of her character. This is who she is, a badass who survives against all odds. But none of it is in evidence at all on her character. And again, you could argue, oh, but what if the symbiote heals her? What if the symbiote makes sure that even if she takes terrible damage, it heals up completely perfectly? And to that I say, again, maybe that would be somewhat interesting, but that's not actually in her story. That there's no part of her lore where it is said that her symbiote can heal her from pretty much any battle damage. So, while that may be valid if Riot ever decide to expand her story in that direction, sure, I would think that that was very boring, but sure, that could be a narrative excuse. But for the moment, that narrative excuse doesn't exist. Even if that was part of her story, though, I would still criticize that for being boring and kinda lazy. Like, it's a hand-wavy explanation that just kind of excuses the character from ever feeling any consequences of their actions. It's the equivalent of covering over a plot hole by waving a hand and saying, oh, a wizard did it. You just invent an explanation out of thin air so that you don't actually have to address the narrative and thematic inconsistency of the thing that you have created. Kai'Sa, to me, when I look at her, always represents a huge lost opportunity. A lost opportunity for so many interesting design decisions that would do a good job of communicating who and what a character is, all for the benefit, I guess, of adding one more hot, sexy, attractive lady to a video game that is already tripping over itself with an abundance of hot, sexy, attractive ladies. And you can argue that sex sells till the cows come home if you want to. You would be wrong. The reality is a lot more complicated than that. And it's also irrelevant to the criticism that I'm actually making. I'm not criticizing Kai'Sa for being commercially unviable. I don't care if she's commercially viable. I'm criticizing her for being bad character design because it fails at the most basic task of character design, which is to communicate a character to an audience. Her design doesn't communicate her character. It communicates a character that's vaguely tangentially related, but which lacks all of the visual signifiers that would actually let you know who this person is and what kind of a life they have led. Anyway, if I do another one of these videos, it'll probably be about Ashe. Thank you very much for listening, I suppose.